Hey, seventh grade world history. Sure do miss you guys. Hopefully this will all be over for too long and we'll be able to get back and have class and y'all can laugh at each other and all those things that y'all like to do. Uh, I'm working out a way to get worksheets to you, quizzes to you. I think it's all going to work out, and obviously when it does, you just fill them out and do what you need to do with it and then send it back. And I'll grade them and eventually get it on RenWeb. Right now we're in chapter 19, section 3, talking about how the Industrial Revolution changed society, which it did in a big way in several areas, and that's kind of what we want to talk about for a few minutes today. When the main changes that happened, which got people together, was that cities started to grow. They started making factories. They took the jobs out of people's homes and put them in towns. We've talked about this some before. And people moved into town so they'd have a job. Britain was the first country to become urbanized. Urbanization was one of your vocab words that you'll be doing or have done. And of course, here in the United States, we're certainly an urbanized nation. More people live in and around cities today and towns than they do out in the country. But I'm a country boy, thank God. That's a song, I believe. How it got started was basically what capitalism is all about. It had somebody had some money. They wanted to start a business, so they could start the business. They got to choose that business, which is the big thing about capitalism. You still had sort of class systems. You had the less. You had wealthy class, of course. They owned the factories, ran the factories. And then they had people that worked for them, and also these were the managers and were called the working class. Some of them worked really hard. Again, you had different levels of that, just like you do today. You have people who are wealthier than others, and so therefore they have more power and prestige in society. You had the working conditions were really bad compared to how they are today. They worked 6 days a week, usually, just only missed work on Sunday so they could go to church, that type of stuff. The conditions were really nasty, a lot of dust and things, a lot of diseases that came out of a lot of these types of jobs because of the working conditions. Children were hired to do a lot of the work, and of course they didn't get paid much. They, if they couldn't make it to work, they were afraid they would lose their job. There was no guarantees of anything. You had to be there, or it was, it was too bad. Eventually, women got out of some of this and started in different types of jobs as the cities grew, but you had that. During that time period. On page 733, there's the way it was about young people in the working force back during that time. I'd like for you to read that and just see, maybe compare your life to what life was like back then. I think you'll find you have a pretty good deal going on now. As people had more leisure time to didn't have to work all the time. They could start thinking about other things. And that's some of the other things that came out of the Industrial Revolution. New political ideas. This idea of liberalism. Now, what they thought of as liberalism and what we today think of liberalism it's almost opposite from what their liberals talked about. In your book on page 735, it says, and I'm quoting, liberals in the 1800s believed that all people have basic rights. These include equality before the law and freedom of speech and press. Many liberals wanted freedom of religion. Liberals also believed that power of government should be limited by a written constitution and that elected assemblies should make the laws. That's kind of opposite today. You'd think that's more conservative values in today's time, but during this time in history, back in the 1800s, that's what was referred to as liberalism. There was a guy, he's also in the words that you'll be looking up, Adam Smith. He came here to America and visited in the 1800s, early 1800s, and he saw how our country was growing and was very impressed with that. Your book doesn't mention it, but he wrote a book which became quite famous called The Wealth of Nations. And he just talked about how middle-class people here in America could rise up based on their education, their desire to rise up. And he was very impressed with that. And in a few minutes, we'll compare that idea to a guy named Karl Marx, who also was around during this time. Karl Marx came up with an idea called socialism. And, if you've been keeping up any kind of news and stuff about the presidential election, you've heard about Bernie Sanders and socialism and how he thinks that's the best way to go. But the guy that came up with that idea was a guy named Karl Marx. He believed that, he called this group the proletariat, one of your vocab words. He believed that, and these were the workers of the world, and he believed that one day they would rise up and overthrow the ruling class, and then they would be living this communal life. That's never happened. Karl Marx taught that. The Russians tried that in 1917 to get out of World War I, but it's never worked. You can, as a matter of fact, we may do a report on these, some of these countries that have tried socialism, communism, and the only way it works pretty much is with force. So when you compare it to capitalism, a huge difference there in freedoms you have, freedoms you don't have, according to these two types of governing systems. Some countries have tried it. No country that I know of has ever really worked in. But that was Karl Marx. His book, and your book doesn't mention it, but one was called Das Kapital, talking about capitalism, and the other was called, I forgot what the other one was called. The Communist Manifesto. There it is. I knew that. So that was changes in government that came about during the Industrial Revolution. Also, now that they've got more time on their hands, they started thinking differently about things in art and literature, that kind of stuff. Your book talks about romanticism. Romanticism is not just hugging and kissing, which is what a lot of people think about. The idea of romanticism, according to the definition in your book, says they value the feelings and imagination as the best way to find truth. So that could be, I'm going to war, and that's a romantic thought because I think I'm going to go there and I'm going to become a hero, that kind of stuff. So it's, that's what they mean a lot of times when they say this is romantic, and it's not about hugging and kissing and stuff. It's about these other things, about having good feelings, the way you think about stuff. Some of the people that made this idea, who became famous in this idea, you had a guy named William Wordsworth, and you had a guy named Johann Goethe, who they looked at nature and they saw the expressed their inner feelings in their paintings that they did and poems and things that they wrote. So that was this idea of romanticism. You've all probably heard of Beethoven. Oh, wait a minute, it's not Beethoven, it's Beethoven. And his music was upbeat and about nature and all this kind of stuff. So this romantic idea became pretty strong, and later on when you get to high school and college, you'll be taking classes in English, literature, that type of stuff, where you'll study more about these sorts of people. Another group that came out of that was called the realist. They tried to see things as life truly was, because And so a lot of their poetry and things of that nature wasn't always about pretty and pleasant things, but it was about the reality of life, maybe how bad it was working in a factory during that time. Uh, a couple of people that came out of that, Charles Dickens, maybe you've heard of Charles Dickens, a guy named Leo Tolstoy from Russia, but they focused on ordinary people and ordinary events. They didn't, they just told it like it was, which is what they mean by realism. In art, two theories were modernism and impressionism. In modernism, again, it was study about social problems in the paintings and the books that they wrote during that time. It was, how things really were, how things weren't always really nice and pleasant, but sometimes just ugly. And so that was the idea behind realism. In art, impressionism became the thing. They were interested in the effects of light, so theirs was more of a, I'm going to paint this picture, and the light's going to, if it's a painting of water, it's going to show reflections and things like that. A guy named Claude Monet was one of the people. A guy named Renoir. French people were into that pretty much. So anyway, you had those kinds of things in that. There's a lot of things taking place in science and medicine during this period. You had a really important guy. Was a guy named Louis Pasteur. He was a French guy, and he came up with the idea, and it's called pasteurization, named after him. And of course, if you read on a milk label, it'll say pasteurized. And what that means is he discovered that if you use heat, it will kill bacteria. They didn't know that before. He discovered this. And of course, this led to a lot of other things. Vaccines came out during this Industrial Revolution period. In 1796, you had an English doctor named Edward Jenner. A lot of people were getting smallpox and dying, and he found out that dairy workers who were around the cows all the time, they would get a pox called a cowpox. But he found out if he took the I don't know how it all worked, but anyway, that he could take the germs and stuff and inject that into a person, and that would keep them from getting smallpox. Like I said, I'm not smart to understand all that, but and of course we know about all these vaccines with this coronavirus and thing that's going around now. You have people trying to find a vaccine, trying to find a way to cure that and keep people from getting it again. And hopefully they'll come up with something like that, and hopefully it'll be real soon so we can get back to school. I miss seeing you guys. But anyway, Pasteur, like I say, he's a French guy, and he proved that that germs cause disease. They didn't even know there were germs and things back then. They didn't even think about stuff like that. It was totally unknown. And of course, through his work, his research and all, he comes up with this way to kill the germs which cause the diseases. So that's a big deal. Another thing that they came up with during this time was a way to, when you're having surgery, they had nothing. They would maybe give you a stick to bite on, and just start cutting on you. And then they came up with ether, is what it was called. And of course now they have other things, but at least they could have you knocked out, so that when they were cutting on your leg or doing something like that, they you didn't feel it, and they were able to do it that way. Before, they, like I said, they'd have you bite on a stick or a belt, and somebody lay on top of you. If they're cutting on your leg, then lay on top of you so you can't thrash around, and they would saw your leg off. That'd be a pretty tough way to go. Another thing, a guy named Joseph Lister came up with a way to sterilize the medical equipment. because before that, before he came up with that, they'd take the same knife or saw or whatever it was they were using to cut on a person. They just rinse the blood off of it and start all over again. This is why so many people in the Civil War here in America died. More people died from infection than they did from gunshot wounds, because they just didn't know about these germs and things at that time. They weren't able to, to sterilize and all that sort of stuff. So another person named Mendel, he developed a system of rules that could predict whether a living organism would inherit traits from its parents, and he became known as the father of genetics, which we hear a lot about today. I mean, you can see these commercials on TV where you can send off, basically take some of your DNA and find out, where your family came from, all sorts of stuff like that. Everybody's heard of Albert Einstein, of course, and he's it was during the latter part of this time period in the late 1800s that he came about with his studies. And of course, his theory is known as the theory of relativity, stating basically that space and time were relative and changing, whereas before people thought it was this way and it had always been that way and would always be that way. So that was a change there. Of course, I guess you probably heard of his famous equation, E equals mc squared. E is energy, m is mass, and it says C is the speed of light. Again, I'm not smart enough to understand all that, but I'm sure some of y'all are. And one day you'll be a famous scientist or something, because y'all are some smart people. You just like to act goofy sometimes. On page 739 in your book, there's a list of the scientists during this time period from 1803 to 1905. It tells what their discovery was and how important that was. I would suggest that you look over that before we get around to the chapter test, which will be taken sometime probably latter part of next week, and then hopefully after that we'll get back to school. But you never know how that'll work out. Hopefully it will. One other person in the section that's we need to mention is a guy named Charles Darwin. Probably you've heard of Charles Darwin. He's the guy that came up with the idea of evolution, that things evolve from something less or lower and to a better situation. I personally don't believe that, but that's he wrote a book as well. It's amazing how many world things have come about because somebody wrote a book. We talked about Karl Marx in his book. Charles Darwin has written a book called The Origin of the Species. Now, I don't think that's not mentioned in your book, but eventually, again, you'll learn more about that when you get further along. But remember when we were doing the Jim Crow stuff back in February, and we talked about social Darwinism? This idea that they believe that society, as well as groups of people, evolved to where what's a good way to say it, where the cream rises to the top, so to speak. And that's how they that's how they justified these Jim Crow laws, where they were saying that black people were stupid, couldn't do anything, not much different than an animal. And then they would go to these countries that were colored, browns and blacks and just different shades, not white people. And they said, well, because America is doing great, France is doing great, Germany is doing great, that said, there you go, there's proof that social Darwinism is true, that these countries are successful, and you take these countries, Africa, India, Orient, China, places like that, during this time in history, they weren't doing well. And that was their justification for even going into those countries and taking advantage of them, which will eventually lead to World War I, as we'll find out later in the next couple of chapters. Well, that's all I got for you now. I'll be sending you some assignments and a date that it's due by, all that sort of stuff. please, when you write the answers, don't put Karl Marx, a man. You know, why is he in the history book? Yeah, he was a man, but be detailed. Since we don't get the opportunity to explain all this stuff all the time in as much detail as we do at school, the more stuff you put down, the better chance you've got of doing well on the test. Like I said, I'll try to get worksheets and quizzes and all that to you. I think I've found a way to make it work. I sure hope so. And you need to listen to this, jot some notes down on it. And I hope everything's going well for you. Stay safe.